Okay, we're back. Love Supreme is currently 19 on Best Ever albums of the 60s. We last talked about Coltrane, Giant Steps, and My Favorite Things, which are episodes 12 and 9, respectively. We did the old reversal there, so My Favorite Things is later than Giant Steps, but we talked about Giant Steps later. Both of those albums came out in 60 and 61. So at this point in his career, after My Favorite Things, he started experimenting more and more and being influenced by things such as world music, Indian ragas, and free jazz by other artists such as Ornette Coleman. His work started taking on a more spiritual element, as well as allowing for more improvisation. And that would carry through past Love Supreme into his albums that he made before he died in 1967. Eric Dolphy joined him for a time, but then left in 1962. The period from 62 to mid-65 is known as the Classic Quartet period, and that's who appears on this album. We have Jimmy Garrison on bass, Elvin Jones on drums, and McCoy Tyner on piano. They released multiple albums during this period, both studio and live albums, and sometimes a mix of both on one album, including with albums such as Ballads, Impressions, Live at Birdland, and Crescent leading up to this. A Love Supreme was recorded on December 9th of 1964 in one take at Van Gelder Studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. This album is considered his masterpiece, and it is a 4-part suite that is an ode to his faith in and love for God. And you have 4 tracks on here: Acknowledgement, Resolution, Pursuance, and Psalm. And this album is categorized as modal jazz, avant-garde jazz, or free jazz typically. Now, after this album, his work would tackle similar concepts, and in the liner notes for this album, he said that in 1957, leading up to this, he experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening which has led me to a richer, fuller, and more productive life. So he really took that to heart and put that on this album. We have this album is often considered a spiritual album and analyzed with religious subtext, although you can make the argument that it's not, as many critics have. And I thought this was a good quote. Jazz critic Martin Gayford said, "If a listener is, quote, in the mood," he wrote, "it's a majestic and compelling. If you're not in the mood, it's interminable and pretentious." So context is everything. NPR did say that this album mirrors Coltrane's spiritual quest that grew out of his personal troubles, including a long struggle with drug and alcohol addiction, as we touched on in previous episodes. I like that spiritual quest idea. I think that's true when listening to this album, and it seems true based on the research I've done for him. I have a lot more about the album itself. So as I said, they did it in one take. That's pretty typical for jazz artists at the time. When they were experimenting is when they were doing live shows, and when they would come into the studio, they would know what they wanted to do, and just put the tracks down. There wasn't really experimentation in the studio. They did do, however, after this was recorded on December 10th, Coltrane wanted to hear how other versions of this might sound, so he brought in a young tenor saxophonist, Archie Shepp, to also accompany on this album, and a second bassist, Art Davis, to play with the quartet. So then they ran through 2 versions of A Love Supreme's opening Acknowledgement, so that Coltrane could explore what the music might sound like with another horn and additional low-end rhythm. That is actually, you can hear on some of the that's out there. I think it's on Spotify if you want to hear the difference. They have multiple deluxe versions of this album, basically collecting everything that was done, and that's on there. They only played A Love Supreme live one time at a July 1965 concert in Antibes, France, which is on the super deluxe version of this album on Spotify, if you're interested. There were no recorded interviews by Coltrane as to where he talks about this album's significance or what it means to him. In fact, Coltrane didn't even talk about it with his bandmates. They didn't discuss what it might mean. Tyner says about that they really didn't discuss the albums when they played together, and he calls the album a culmination and natural extension of the chemistry that the quartet had honed through years of playing together live. It is one of the best-selling jazz albums, definitely of Coltrane's career. It sold pretty well right off the bat, especially compared to his previous albums. It was added to the National Recording Registry in 2016, as we've touched on with many of our other albums, like Trout Mask Replica. And it was actually the theme music to Lester Bangs' wake at CBGB when he died.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. I thought this was interesting also. A religious sect was formed out of this album. Reverend Franzo Wayne King is a pastor of the St. John Coltrane African Orthodox Church in San Francisco. They basically mix African Orthodox liturgy with Coltrane's quotes and a heavy dose of his music. So, I mean, that's about as spiritual as you can get if you can get somebody seeing something profound in your music and forming a religious sect out of it. I don't know how he would feel about that. He never commented on that, or if he I don't think he wanted to be deified, especially with his love of God and religion. But I thought that was interesting. So I have some stuff, since this is the last time we're talking about Coltrane, I have a short wrap up of what happened after A Love Supreme came out. But what did you guys think about this album? How about we start with John? Did you have a spiritual journey on this, listening to this album, John?
I don't know if I had a spiritual journey, but I really like this album. I love the fact that it was separated into 4 distinct parts, and I think the music pieces really did a good job of giving you the feel as a listener of what he was going for based on the terms that they used for each of the pieces. I don't know if that's making sense how I'm describing. I hope it's making sense as I'm describing it. But
yes.
I love the way the first track came in with the bass line. It's fantastic at the beginning. Yep. The overblowing, which John Coltrane is known for, was excellent. And this, I loved it because we've talked about it before. That he's very restrained, John Coltrane, with all of this ability and the ability to take over pieces. He always seems to not indulge himself in that. But in this album, I definitely noticed he took the lead a lot more quicker. And it was welcomed because I enjoy the way that he plays. He's discordant without being uncomfortably discordant at times. And I've come to really appreciate the discordancy in jazz as we listen to more albums, but I still can also appreciate the fact that he's able to marry those discordant sounds with a smoother, sort of polished edge to it as well.
Yeah.
And I love the thing that you linked to us, Josh, where he was talking out what the music was supposed to be sounding like, because boy, yes, does that really give you a feel for what he was going for in that particular track. As the 4th and final piece, I think that we got, and we're going to put up on, or actually you may have, right? Put up,
yeah, I did,
on the Twitter account, and I would urge those that are becoming new to jazz or love jazz or just, are interested in hearing what Coltrane's thoughts were. It's a real interesting way to listen to the 4th and final track. But I really like this, and his backing band is fantastic. Everybody plays their roles perfectly. I've got more thoughts, but I don't want to go long. I'll pitch to Matt now because I'll be interested to hear what his take is.
Yeah, before Matt starts, what John was referring to is the 4th track, Psalm. He wrote a poem to God in the liner notes of the album, and each of those, it's basically like a wordless poem. The 4th track can be thought as, and basically each word in that poem is a note on the on the song. So you can, the link I put on Twitter, you can follow along with the poem while listening to the fourth track and hear and see the words as as he's playing, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a wordless poem, I think they refer to it as. So yeah, it's pretty neat. But Matt, yeah,
that was cool. I've known this record for many years. I bought it back when I was in college. And so that was, and I never knew that, so getting that video link today was pretty cool. And it did kind of show that song in a little bit of a different way, for me. So that was very cool. So this is my favorite jazz album that we've covered so far. And I think it really does a good job of mixing, the avant-garde style and free form jazz, kind of that we've already talked about a little bit with like Dolphy and Pharoah Sanders. But but it also, again, is going back to what I like with that type of stuff, being couched in more structure, more accessibility overall. And I attribute that a lot to what the other musicians are doing in this record. I think I agree with John that the other musicians, particularly the drummer, I think is the other one that really stands out to me, aside from Coltrane. They all get their due. They all have their own little parts, their solos that they're involved in, and the drumming is just, well, all the musicianship is spectacular, but the drumming in particular stood out for me. The solos that the guy's doing is just unreal, and he's doing it for a couple minutes on end. I think isn't it how the third track opens up with just just like a big drum solo. And it's also cool because then the third track might be my favorite. It's just like I hesitate to call it frantic because I don't think it's not terribly all over the place, but it's definitely the busiest, I would say, of the three tracks. But it starts with an elaborate, fast-paced drum solo that's really cool, and it ends with like a slower kind of like downbeat bass, like 2.5 minutes of acoustic bass, stand-up bass playing. You get a little vocals in here, which is rare for a jazz album, in the opening track. It kind of opens, actually. It's almost similar to kind of how the Pharoah Sanders album opens. I picked up on that a little bit. So you can definitely see the influence of Coltrane on those two artists, Pharoah Sanders and Eric Dolphy, and certainly what they did with that, and they took it in a more extravagant direction with the freeform jazz, which I wasn't as much of a fan of. But this is great. And I'm not a huge jazz fan. I don't regularly reach for a jazz album to put on, but this is a very enjoyable listen. It's got each track has a different feel. I like how it ends. There's timpani at the end, so it gives us this dramatic kind of punctuation at the end of the record overall. And it's really good. And he is kind of blasting a little bit on the saxophone, but it's also he reins it back in. There's soloing going on in freeform, but there's also structure with what he's doing as well with the written stuff. So as far as jazz albums go, at least with the ones that we've covered, and I know there's plenty more out there. And we didn't get to cover Kinda Blue, which is another very accessible, good, high. Bestseller, considered one of the greatest of all times. This is up there. If you're going to if you have a little bit of an adventurous palette, I don't even think you need a major one, but just a little bit of one, and you want to see a little bit more of a freeform jazz kind of thing, I would definitely recommend this because it's got a little bit of everything as far as jazz goes, and I definitely appreciated it about that.
Yeah, this and Kinda Blue are often considered like the jazz albums to get if you're going to get any of them.
Yeah, 1A, 1B.
Yeah, and I really like this album too. I've come to appreciate Coltrane. I feel like he is the most accessible, I guess would be the best word, of the artists that we've listened to, because they've all skewed towards kind of the free jazz, with the exception of maybe Miles Davis, who is a bit more restrained and low key. I really like how, like John said, Coltrane toes the line between hewing to the structure and then like kind of going outside of it a little bit, and like you said, Matt, giving all the artists on the quartet their due, and each getting that ability to improvise and have their solos and their chance to shine too. I mean, if anything, our discussion of jazz albums just shows how all of these guys are so talented and so at the top of their game, more so, and you can't hide in a jazz quartet. You all have to be good.
Yeah.
Because you're all playing off each other, and then you all get solos as well. I really appreciate how the intent of this album and how the structure with the 4 tracks, like believe John said, it kind of builds, right? And then it ends with the psalm, which is much more, slowed down and meditative. In the opening acknowledgement, you have, and I think one of you said this as well, there's the 4-note bass line that repeats over and over, and that's when the chanting of A Love Supreme comes in at the end. And I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but he also plays that 4-note line on his sax over and over in different key combinations as well, using all the different keys on the sax, which I thought was really cool. It also opens with a gong in acknowledgement, which is fun. And acknowledgement really builds the foundation for the whole suite with that repetition and A Love Supreme. And that 4-note thing kind of comes in and out in other points very lightly throughout the other tracks as well. I, like you said, Matt, there's an intensity is the note I used for resolutions and pursuance on track 2 and 3. I like how he really surprises you with like explosions of saxophone at points. He just comes in, like on track 2 at the resolution, you get the bass, I think it starts, or the piano, and then you get the explosion of the sax out of nowhere, and that happens. And I really like hearing the artists get their own solos. I don't ever recall ever hearing a bass solo, and it's so interesting because that's not an instrument you think of that would get a solo. It's weird and cool just to hear it by itself playing something,
especially the acoustic bass, which is a very muted, very toned down. It's not loud at all. It's almost like you have to strain to listen to it. So it's another added level of kind of being an interesting way to do a solo.
Yep. And as we said, that 4th track psalm goes hand in hand with the poem, which adds to it too. I really got a lot benefited from researching this album. There's a lot of writing on it out there, and people's interpretations of it and pointing out things. So yeah, this is definitely, of the 3 that we've talked about, I think this is probably my favorite.
Coltrane album?
Yeah, Coltrane album of the 3. Although they all are very different, and they kind of, as we've touched on before, they're different parts of his career. But yeah, you can't go this, like we said too, Coltrane's a good starting point of the different jazz artists that we've talked about, with the exception of maybe Miles Davis too.
But I would probably, with Davis, I wouldn't say go with Sketches of Spain or go with In a Silent Way as your first opening record.
No.
So this is, in terms of like more of a traditional jazz sound, because Sketches of Spain was like classical music infused, and like, In a Silent Way was fusion rock. So that's not like a traditional quote unquote type of jazz. So that's why I think that this is kind of really hitting that sweet spot of what you really think of when you hear jazz, and how it's really straddling the line well with the avant-garde and the accessible in such a great way. And it's I mean, there's only 4 tracks, and they're like 7-8 minutes long, but it's not a long album overall. It's like 30 minutes, so it certainly doesn't overstay its welcome.
No.
I agree. This is a really enjoyable album that makes for like good meditation music, as is often mentioned about this album. It's one that you can put on in the background, and you can lean into it and feel it, I think. And I think the spiritual journey part of it is very apt, because that's what it feels like, in a different way than Pharoah Sanders did, right? But you can see kind of what Pharoah Sanders took from this as being, associated with John Coltrane too, because it's not hard to see what Coltrane was doing on this album, and how, if you took it in different directions, it could lead to what Pharoah Sanders was doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually did read an article about somebody who during this pandemic, woke up every morning and listened to this album as kind of like a meditation to start their day. I mean, I don't know how long they did that for, but that was at the beginning. So I thought that was interesting, and I could see that. It does feel that way. And as I said before, after this album, he and the quartet and other members of that he brings in, they get more and more free jazz oriented. In June of 1965, he recorded a 38-minute song called Ascension with 10 other musicians, including Pharoah Sanders, and they all had solos and improvisation between the solos. So if you thought, Love Supreme was kind of free jazz, that's even more so. This is a good quote about that. Jazz author, critic Gary Giddens said, "Those who followed Coltrane to the edge of the galaxy now had the added challenge of a player who appeared to have little contact with Earth," and talking about Pharoah Sanders. The quartet itself disbanded shortly after this, or a little bit after this, after Coltrane added a second drummer, which I can't imagine having two drums on a jazz album. The pianist Tyner said that he couldn't hear himself play over the drummers, so that's why he left. And when touring, the group would also be known for playing long versions of their songs, many stretching beyond 30 minutes to an hour. So that's where all the improvisation and freeform come in. Solos by the band members would often extend beyond 15 minutes. So that's just crazy in and of itself. But he never stopped searching for that spiritual quest. He did die of liver cancer at the age of 40 on July 17th, 1967. No one in the music community knew how sick he was. It's often thought that, with his heavy drug use early on, either from the heroin or from alcohol, either something, with hepatitis related or cirrhosis of the liver, something affected his liver from all that stuff, and that's ultimately what led to him dying. He is buried at Pine Lawn Cemetery in Farmingdale, New York, which is part of Long Island National Cemetery. So if you ever want to go see his grave, he's there. And that's it. That concludes our John Coltrane journey, the 3 albums that we talked about. But this is definitely a high point for me. I think for you guys as well, it seems like.
Yeah, I thought all his albums were good. I enjoyed all of them, but this one I think is definitely, it takes it up a notch. But it's, man, he's good. It's sad, like when I heard about his young age of dying, I'm like, oh, I had to be like, you think of jazz artists in the 60s, it's got to be like a heroin overdose or something. But no, it's good stuff.
Yep.